The judge read for 11 minutes without looking up. I know because I counted every second. I sat at the plaintiff's table with my attorney beside me and my hands flat on the surface in front of me. Not clasped, not fidgeting, just flat and still. And I watched the judge's eyes move across the pages of the counterfile I had spent 3 years building. 147 pages. Tabbed, indexed, cross-referenced, with a summary document at the front that my attorney had told me was the cleanest evidentiary package she had seen in 20 years of family law. The opposing attorney sat 12 feet away. Her name was Diane Mercer. She had been my ex-husband's attorney for the past 4 years. She had also been his girlfriend for at least 3 of them. A fact she had never disclosed. A fact that was documented on page 62 of my counterfile, and a fact that would, in the weeks following that hearing, end her legal career. When the judge finally looked up, she looked at Diane first. Then she looked at me. She said, "I've been doing this for years. I have never seen a record like this." I said nothing. I had already said everything I needed to say. I had said it in 147 pages, and I had said it without raising my voice once. My name is Claire, and this is the story of what happened when I decided to stop defending myself and start documenting everything instead. My daughter Lily was 4 years old when her father and I separated. She is 8 now. In the 4 years between those two ages, I attended 22 court hearings, filed 19 motions, responded to 31 discovery requests, and spent approximately $60,000 in legal fees, which was $30,000 more than I had, and the remainder of which I paid back over 2 years through a repayment plan my attorney has arranged because she believed in the case. And I think because she had started to understand what we were actually not dealing with. What we were dealing with was a man named Owen, methodical, patient, and possessed of a particular kind of intelligence that presents well in professional settings and conceals itself in personal ones. He was a financial analyst. He was good at building narratives. He was good at finding the right people to help him build them. And 4 months after I filed for divorce, he hired Diane Mercer to represent him in our custody proceedings. I did not know at that point that Diane and Owen had been introduced by mutual friends 8 months earlier. I did not know they had been in contact in ways that went beyond professional correspondence. I found out later through a series of documents that Owen had not realized I was entitled to request. But I am getting ahead of myself. The beginning of this story is not the counterfile. The beginning is the first hearing, where I sat across from a woman I had never met, watched her present a portrait of me that I did not recognize, and understood, with a clarity that felt like stepping from a warm room into cold air, that something was being built. That I was looking at the beginning of a structure designed to take my daughter from me. I drove home from that hearing and sat in my driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside to where my mother was waiting with Lily. I was not crying. I was thinking. Owen and I had been together for 7 years before I filed. For the first 4, we were good. I don't say that as a revision of history. We were genuinely good. He was funny in the early days and curious, and he remembered small things about people that made them feel seen. He was the kind of person who sent follow-up messages after difficult conversations, who brought flowers home from the grocery store on unremarkable Tuesdays, who seemed to understand that love was not a state but a practice. It changed slowly enough that I didn't notice until the change was already total. By our 5th year, his memory for small details had turned into a running ledger of my failures. The flowers stopped. The follow-up messages became, instead, documents, emails he would send recapping conversations we'd had, reframing them in language that reading back made me sound unstable, unreasonable, impossible to satisfy. I didn't understand at the time what he was doing. I thought he was processing. I thought he was trying to be precise. It took me another 1.5 years and a therapist named Wendy, who specialized in high control relationship dynamics, to understand that he had been building a record. Quietly, patiently, for reasons I couldn't yet name. I spent 2 years trying to find the right way to reach him before I gave up. I want to say that clearly, because it matters. I tried the direct version, sitting down at the kitchen table after Lily was asleep and saying plainly that the emails made me feel surveilled, that the ledger felt punishing, that I needed us to find a different way of communicating. He listened. He said he understood. He asked clarifying questions in the tone of someone taking careful notes. And then, 3 days later, a new email arrived recapping that conversation, describing me as escalating and unable to hear feedback. I tried the softer version. I tried timing it differently, catching him in a good mood on a weekend morning when Lily was playing in the other room and the house felt light. I made coffee the way he liked it. I said I missed the early version of us, that I wanted to find it again. He put his hand on mine. He said he missed it too. That same week, a new file appeared in the email chain, a summary of recurring patterns, dated and organized, going back 14 months since. I tried therapy. He came to 2 sessions, answered every question thoughtfully, and gave the therapist a version of me that I sat 3 feet away from and did not recognize. After the 2nd session, the therapist pulled me aside and asked if I felt safe. I said I didn't understand the question. I was still learning the shape of what I was in. In the end, I did not leave because as I stopped loving him. I left because Wendy, after 8 months of individual sessions, said something that finally named it. She said, "He is not interested in resolution. He is interested in your file." And I drove home from that session and sat in the driveway for a long time and understood that the 2 years I had spent trying to get back to the early version of us had been 2 years he'd spent preparing for a different conversation entirely. When Lily was 2, I told him I wanted a separation. He was calm. He nodded. He said he understood. He said he wanted what was best for Lily. That night, while I put Lily to bed, he forwarded 17 months of those follow-up emails to an external account I would later learn belonged to Diane Mercer. He had found her before I filed, before I knew I was going to file. He had found her, established the relationship, and handed her a pre-built case file, all before I ever walked into a courtroom. I found out about the emails 18 months later, through a discovery request my attorney Priya filed after noticing pattern inconsistencies in opposing counsel's response timeline. But I am, again, getting ahead of myself. The first year of the custody proceedings felt like being dismantled in slow motion. His initial filing requested Prism residential custody, citing what he described as my emotional dysregulation, inability to maintain a stable home environment, and pattern of placing her own psychological needs ahead of the child's. The language was specific, clinical. the kind of language that sounds like it came from a professional assessment, which it appeared to because attached to the filing was a letter from a child psychologist named Dr. Harlan supporting the claims. I had never met Dr. Harlan. Lily had never met Dr. Harlan. Neither of us had been assessed by Dr. Harlan. My attorney Priya filed an immediate objection. The judge ordered Dr. Harlan's full methodology and appointment records. What came back was as a letter written on what appeared to be professional letterhead, supported by a narrative summary of my behavior compiled entirely from materials Owen had provided, the 17 months of follow-up emails, and additional written accounts Owen had generated himself. Dr. Harlan had not conducted an independent assessment. She had reviewed Owen's materials and written a letter based on them. This was not illegal, technically. It was, however, the kind of thing that, when laid out clearly in a response motion, causes judges to look at opposing counsel with a particular expression. Diane filed a response arguing that the methodology was standard and the objection was performative. The judge overruled the objection, but noted in the record that the letter would be considered in context. I drove home and sat in my driveway for a long time before I went inside. Then I went to my kitchen drawer, found a yellow legal pad I had bought for grocery lists and never used, and sat down at the kitchen table. I wrote the date at the top of the first page. Below it, I wrote first hearing. Dr. Harlan letter, methodology not independent. Judge noted for context. Diane's response, performative. Below that, I wrote one more line, and then I sat back and looked at it. The line said, she has been in this room before. She knows the furniture. That was when I understood what I was dealing with. Not a legal dispute, a performance that someone had rehearsed. And the only answer to a rehearsed performance, the only thing that cannot be rehearsed around, is documentation so complete that there is nothing left to perform against. I did not know, sitting at that kitchen table with a grocery list legal pad, that the notebook would eventually become a 147-page counterfile. I just knew that the shape of what was happening needed to be recorded before it could be mapped, and that I was, from that moment, the one who was going to map it. That notebook became the first section of the counterfile. My mother's name is Barbara. She is 67 years old, retired, and the most methodical person I have ever known. When I was growing up, she kept every receipt, every school report, every letter in labeled accordion folders organized by year. She was a paralegal for 31 years before she retired. And when I explained to her what was happening, not the emotional version, the logistical version, the sequence of events version, she went quiet for a moment and then said, "Show me everything you have." She moved in with me when Lily was 4.5, ostensibly to help with childcare while the proceedings continued. But actually, I think, because she had understood what I had not yet articulated, that this was going to be a long fight, and that long fights require someone who can hold the shape of the thing while you are living inside it. She was the one who first suggested requesting Diane Mercer's bar registration history, not because she knew what we would find, but because she said that when something smells wrong for long enough, you start at the edges and work inward. Diane's bar history was clean. No complaints, no disciplinary actions. She had been practicing for 14 years. But Barbara was the one who noticed that Diane's listed business address had changed 3 times in the past 4 years, and that the second address a suite in a downtown professional building, was the same address currently listed as the secondary business address of Owen's financial analysis firm. We looked at that for a long time. Then we started pulling the thread. Let me tell you what a guardian ad litem is, because the one assigned to our case, a woman named Sandra Osei, became one of the most important people in this story. A guardian ad litem is an attorney appointed by the court to represent the interests of a child in custody proceedings. They are independent. They do not represent either parent. They are there specifically to cut through the narrative that each side is building and report back to the judge what they actually observe. Sandra had been doing this work for 16 years. She interviewed me, Owen, both our attorneys, Lily's teachers, Lily's pediatrician, and 3 family members from each side. She spent 4 hours at my home across 2 visits. She spent 2 hours at Owen's. She attended one of Lily's school events without identifying herself, observing. At the 12-month mark of the proceedings, Sandra submitted her preliminary report. I was present in the courtroom when Diane received her copy. I watched her read the first 2 pages. I watched her expression change in a way that she had trained herself not to show, and that she almost succeeded in not showing. Sandra's report noted that Lily was thriving in my primary care, that the child showed no signs of the instability described in the initial filing, and that the child had made one unprompted comment during a session. A comment that Sandra quoted directly about preferring to stay at mommy's house because daddy's house has different rules every time. That was not the part that made Diane's expression change. The part that made Diane's expression change was footnote 11, in which Sandra noted that she had requested Owen's original case file materials, including the Dr. Harlan letter and the 17 months of follow-up emails, to assess the evidentiary basis of the initial claims, and that in reviewing those materials, she had found 3 documents that appeared to share metadata, indicating they had been created or modified by the same user account on the same device within a 48-hour window, despite purporting to have been generated independently across a 16-month period. Sandra had not yet drawn a conclusion. She had noted an inconsistency and flagged it for court review. But I was watching Diane's face, and I had been watching faces for 3 years. I knew what that look meant. I want to tell you about the 11 months between Sandra's preliminary report and the final hearing, because this is the part that most people don't see when they imagine what it looks like to build a counterfile. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It does not feel, while you are in it, like something that is moving anywhere. It feels like waking up at 5 in the morning to organize documents before your daughter gets up for school. It feels like phone calls with Priya on your lunch break, parsing the language of a discovery response for what it is and is not saying. It feels like sitting across from your ex-husband in a racer's office and understanding that he is waiting for you to break, to cry, to yell, to give him something he can document, and choosing, instead, to keep your hands flat on the table. It feels like being inside a clock and not being able to see the hands move. But the hands were moving. The metadata inconsistency Sandra had flagged led to a formal discovery request for the device on which the documents had been created. Owen's attorney, Diane, filed 3 objections to the request over a period of 4 months. Each was overruled. When the device records were finally produced, They confirmed what the metadata had suggested. 6 documents presented as independent corroboration of Owen's claims had been created within a compressed window on a device registered to Owen in a shared account that also carried Diane's professional email credentials. This was not a gray area. This was an attorney accessing and potentially assisting in the creation of materials presented to the court as independent evidence while representing one party in the proceedings, without disclosure of her personal relationship with that party. Priya spent 4 days drafting the response motion. I read every draft. On the third night, 11:30, she called me and said, "Claire, I need to ask you something. When this lands, it is going to be significant. Are you ready for significant?" I told her I had been building toward this for 3 years. I told her I had 147 pages and I was ready for the judge to read every one of them. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, then let's finish it." The bar complaint was filed simultaneously with the discovery violation motion. That is procedural detail, but it matters, because filing them simultaneously meant that Diane could not address one without implicating the other. She could not argue the discovery violation without opening the question of the undisclosed relationship. She could not challenge the bar complaint without explaining the shared account credentials. There was no path through that did not require her to account for both at once. Priya had designed it that way deliberately. She had seen this kind of construction before, not often, but enough. And she knew that the only way to dismantle it cleanly was to apply pressure at 2 points at the same time, so that moving away from one brought you closer to the other. Owen retained new counsel 6 days after the motions were filed. His new attorney requested a 60-day continuance to review the case history. It was granted. I want to tell you what those 60 days felt like. They felt like the first quiet I had experienced in 4 years. Not peace, exactly. Peace implies resolution, and there was no resolution yet. But quiet, the specific quiet of a structure that has been built and completed and is now simply standing, waiting to be walked through. I took Lily to the park every afternoon that we could. I watched her run and thought about how she had no idea what had been happening in rooms she had never seen, at tables she had never sat at, in documents she would never read. I thought about how the best possible outcome for her was that none of it would ever touch her, that the hearing would happen, the judge would read, the ruling would come, and Lily would simply continue to grow up in my house with no knowledge that there had ever been any question. I thought about my mother sitting at my kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night with her accordion folders and her reading, glasses, cross-referencing address records, and bar registration histories with the same calm she brought to everything. I thought about Sandra Ozzie, who had stood in Lily's classroom doorway during a school event and just watched without an agenda, trying to see what was true. I thought about Priya, who had filed 3 of her own motions for free in the final stretch because we had both run out of money and neither of us had run out of resolve. These were the people who had held the shape of the thing while I was living inside it. These were the people who had made the counterfile possible. And in those 60 days of quiet, I thought about each of them more than I thought about the outcome. I had done everything I could do. Now the judge needed to read. I arrived at the final hearing 40 minutes early. Priya was already there, seated at the plaintiff's table with the counterfile in front of her. 147 pages in a blue binder, tabbed by section, with the summary document on top. She had brought 3 copies, one for the judge, one for the record, one for opposing counsel because we were required to provide it, and because Priya told me this the night before with something that was almost a smile. She wanted Diane to have to pick it up and hold it. Owen arrived with his new attorney, a man named Frank Calloway, who had the specific expression of someone who has reviewed a case file and understood, belatedly, what he has walked into. Owen himself looked smaller than I remembered. Not physically, he was the same height, the same build, but something in the way he held his shoulders had compressed. He sat down across the room and did not look at me. Diane arrived alone. She was no longer representing Owen. She had withdrawn from the case during the continuance. But she was present because the bar complaint proceeding had begun, and under the filing structure Priya had designed, her presence could be suggested at the hearing. She sat in the gallery behind Owen's table. She was wearing a dark gray suit. Her face was composed. She looked at me once briefly as she sat down. I did not look away. When the judge entered and the court came to order, Priya submitted the counterfile. The judge's clerk distributed copies, and then the judge began to read. 11 minutes. 11 minutes of silence, broken on by the sound of pages turning. I kept my hands flat on the table. When the judge looked up after 11 minutes, she did not immediately speak. She looked at Frank Calloway. She looked at Diane in the gallery. She looked at me and Priya. And then she said, "I have the transcript. These are the exact words. I've been doing this for 19 years. I have never seen a record like this." She said she would be taking the full counterfile into consideration alongside Sandra Ossie's final report, which had been submitted the previous week. She said she had several questions about the metadata findings and the bar complaint timeline, and that she would be requesting supplementary documentation from the court's own technology specialist before issuing a ruling. She said, finally, that based on the materials before her, she was issuing an immediate interim order maintaining current residential custody arrangements unchanged, pending final ruling. Owen's new attorney requested a recess. It was granted. In the hallway, Priya and I stood near a window that looked out over the parking structure. She handed me a bottle of water. Neither of us said anything for a moment. Then she said, "You built something airtight, Claire." I thought about 3 years of 5 a.m. mornings, about the notebook I had started keeping in my driveway after the first hearing, when I understood that something was being built against me, and decided to start building something back. About my mother at the kitchen table with her reading glasses and her accordion folders, pulling a thread she couldn't name yet, until the thread led somewhere real. I said, "We built it." She nodded. Then we went back inside. The final ruling came 11 days later, delivered in a written decision that ran to 31 pages. Primary residential custody remained with me. Owen was granted standard alternating weekend visitation with structured communication protocols. The ruling cited the counterfile extensively. The metadata findings, the shared account credentials, the pattern of document irregularities, Sandra Ossie's final report, and the documented gap between the Dr. Harlan letter's methodology and accepted standards for independent psychological assessment. In a section I have read many times since, the judge wrote that the proceedings had been materially compromised by conduct inconsistent with the obligations of legal representation and referred the matter to the state bar for further review. Diane Mercer's disbarment was finalized 7 months after the ruling. She did not appeal it. Owen filed no further motions after the ruling was issued. His attorney's communications went through Frank Calloway, who was professional and brief, and the transition to the new custody schedule was completed without incident. Owen and I have not spoken directly since the hearing. I do not expect that to change. Lily is 8 years old now. She is in 2nd grade. She has a best friend named Phoebe who calls our house at least 3 times a week, and a collection of painted rocks she keeps on her windowsill, each one labeled with a name in her careful, still crooked handwriting. She does not know what happened in the rooms she was never in. She does not know what it cost to keep her life exactly the way she needed it to be. She knows that I come to every school event. She knows that I keep her favorite cereal in the cabinet even when we're running low on everything else. She knows that when she wakes up from a bad dream, I am already moving toward her room before she calls for me. That is what she knows. That is what she will always know. And it is, I have decided, exactly enough. My mother still keeps the accordion folders. They live in the closet of what is now her permanent room in our house. The room that used to be the guest room before we stopped having guests and started having her. She doesn't take them out anymore. But she hasn't thrown them away either. I asked her once, about a year after the ruling, why she'd stayed. She had her own home, her own routines, her own life. She had come to help, and the helping was done. She looked at me for a moment with the expression she has when she's deciding whether to say the simple version or the true version. She said, "Because you were going to win. And I wanted to be here when you did." I thought about that for a long time. I think about it still. There is a version of this story where I fought loudly, where I confronted Owen in the hallway outside the mediator's office, where I called Diane out in front of the court on the day I first noticed something was wrong, where I let the anger I felt, and I felt it. I want to be clear. I felt it in a way that was constant and physical and sometimes difficult to breathe through, where I let that anger be visible and public and sharp. That version of the story does not end with a 31-page ruling and a blue binder and 11 minutes of a judge reading without looking up. That version of the story ends differently. I am not a saint. I am not someone who found a way to stop being angry. I am someone who found a place to put the anger that made it useful instead of visible. I put it into the notebook, into the folders, into the overnight hours when Lily was asleep and I was at the kitchen table with my mother, cross-referencing dates, and teaching myself what discovery requests were and learning the difference between what opposing counsel was required to produce and what they were hoping I wouldn't ask for. I put it into a counterfile, and the counterfile stood in the courtroom when I couldn't afford to. I want to say something before I go to anyone who is living inside something like this right now, not the specifics of it. Every situation is its own architecture, and I am not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice, but the shape of it, the feeling of being in a long fight against someone with more resources than you, who has already decided what the story is and hired someone to tell it for them. Here is what I know. They are counting on your anger. They are counting on the exhaustion. They are counting on the fact that it is easier to react than to build, and that building takes time you are not sure you have. And Patience that does not feel available when you are in the middle of a court hearing, watching someone describe you in language you do not recognize. They are not counting on the notebook. They are not counting on the accordion folder in the closet or the retired paralegal who knows what a discovery request is, or the attorney who will file 3 motions for free in the final stretch because she has started to understand what she's actually looking at. They are not counting on 147 pages. Build the pages. Build them quietly and completely and without announcing that you're building them. Because the truth does not need you to be loud. It just needs you to be thorough. And when the judge finally reads, you will want to have given her something worth reading. If this story reached something in you, if you have ever been in a room where someone was building a version of you that wasn't true and you didn't yet know how to answer it, hit subscribe. Because the next story I'm going to tell you is about a man who spent 6 years hiding an entirely second life from his wife, and how she found out at their daughter's graduation dinner, and what she had already prepared for that exact moment. That story is coming soon. I'll see you there. Extended sections, I need to go back and tell you something I skipped over, because the 3 years I described moved faster in the telling than they did in the living. There was a period in the middle, roughly months 14 through 22, that I have not yet described because it was the period I am least proud of and the period that most shaped everything that came after. It was the period when I almost stopped, not legally, not officially. I did not withdraw a filing or miss a hearing or tell Priya I was done. I never did any of those things. But there were approximately 8 months when I went through the motions with the specific, hollow efficiency of someone who is doing the required thing and nothing more. I submitted what was asked of me. I responded to what required response. I showed up. But the building had stopped. The notebook was still open on the kitchen table, but I had not written in it for 3 weeks. The accordion folders my mother kept were getting thicker with incoming documents and thinner with the organizational attention they needed. I was not okay. I want to be specific about what not okay looked like in that period because I think it is important, and because I think the version of this kind of story that gets told most often skips it. The version that gets told is: she was wronged, she was patient, she built her case, she won. The part that gets skipped is the 8 months in the middle when she was none of those things, when she was just tired. When she sat in her car, in the driveway after dropping Lily at school, and could not immediately identify a reason to go inside. My therapist, Wendy, the one who had helped me understand the dynamics of my marriage before the separation, she was the one who named what was happening. She said I was experiencing what she called prolonged threat response fatigue. She said my nervous system had been in a state of sustained alert for over a year, and that it was doing exactly what nervous systems do under those conditions. It was conserving. It was pulling back from anything that was not immediately necessary. And the notebook and the cross-referencing and the discoveries, deep dives, those were not immediately necessary. Surviving the next hearing was immediately necessary. Everything else had started to feel like weight. She asked me a question in one of those sessions that I have thought about many times since. She asked, "What did you think would happen if you stopped fighting?" I told her Lily would be taken from me. She nodded. And then she said, "And what do you think would actually happen if you stopped fighting for 3 days?" not the worst case. What would actually happen? I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. She said, I think you've been running on threat, and I think you need to let yourself feel something else for a few days. Not give up, not stop, just feel something else. I went home. I did not open the notebook. I took Lily to the park and pushed her on the swings until my arms ached. And she laughed with her head thrown back the way she does. And I cried in the car on the way home. Not because anything was wrong, but because everything was still there. She was still there. I was still there. The fight was still there. And 3 days later, I opened the notebook. I want to tell you what that morning was like because it was not dramatic, and that is the point. It was a Thursday. Lily was at school. My mother was at the kitchen table with her coffee. I came downstairs in the clothes I had slept in, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the counter for a moment, looking at the yellow legal pad on the table. The same one I had started the night after the first hearing, now thick with dated entries and cross-references and things underlined twice. I had not touched it in 22 days. I sat down. I picked up the pen. I wrote the date at the top of a new page. And then I wrote month 16, discovery's response deadline, 3 weeks. What have we not asked for yet? Not inspiration, not a breakthrough. Just the next question, written down on a Thursday morning in a house that was quiet, except for my mother turning a page. My mother looked up once, saw the pen moving, and looked back down at her coffee without saying anything. That was the morning the 8 months ended. I want to tell you about Barbara's moment of discovery, because the way she found it was not dramatic, and it is exactly the kind of detail that gets lost when a story becomes a story. She had been cross-referencing Owen's business filings against Diane's bar registration address changes. The 3 addresses she'd found across 4 years. When she noticed that one of the addresses, the second one in the downtown professional building, appeared in one other place in her files, not in a legal document. In a newspaper business supplement that had covered Owen's firm's expansion 2 years earlier. The supplement had listed the firm's principals and their contact information. Owen was listed with his primary business address. Below him, listed as a retained financial and strategic consultant, was a name she hadn't seen before. The address for that name was the same downtown suite. The name was D. Mercer. She looked at that for about 30 seconds. Then she picked up the phone and called me. She said, Claire, I think I found it. I think I found where the relationship started. She was right. The supplement entry was from 2 years before the divorce filing. Owen and Diane had a documented professional relationship that predated the custody proceedings by at least 24 months. And that relationship, that prior undisclosed professional and personal entanglements, was the foundation of everything that followed. The pre-built case file, the 17 months of forwarded emails, the Dr. Harlan letter constructed from Owen's materials, the shared account credentials on the document metadata. It had all started with a business supplement entry in a newspaper that Barbara had clipped because she clips things, because she has always clipped things, because 31 years as a paralegal had taught her that the document that doesn't look important is often the most important document of all. I framed that clipping. I am not joking. It is in a small frame on the bookshelf in my office between a photograph of Lily and a certificate Priya gave me after the ruling with the text of the judge's final paragraph printed on it. It is the single most unglamorous artifact I have ever seen, and it is the piece that made everything else possible. I want to tell you about the 3 days between Priya's call, the one where she asked if I was ready for significant, and the morning of the final hearing. On the first day, I did nothing. I made Lily's breakfast and took her to school and came home and sat in the quiet house and let myself be in it. I did not open the counterfile. I did not call Priya. I watered the plant on the kitchen windowsill that I had somehow kept alive for 3 years through everything which felt significant, and which I know is also a small and slightly absurd thing to note, but which is true. On the second day, I went to see Wendy. We talked for an hour. She asked me how I felt. I told her I felt ready. She asked me what ready felt like.
I told her.
It felt like the thing being finished and just existing now without me having to hold it anymore. Like I had built something and now it was just standing there on its own. And all I had to do was walk into the room with it. She said that sounded like readiness to her, too. On the third day, the night before the hearing, I put Lily to bed early. I read her 3 stories, more than usual, because I wanted to. She fell asleep with her hand curled under her chin the way she does, and I sat beside her bed for a few minutes in the dark and thought about the 4 years she had moved through, unknowingly, while the rooms she wasn't in were doing their work. I thought about what I wanted for her, not the legal version, the actual version. I wanted her to grow up knowing that the people who loved her had held the line, that when something was being built against her life, against her stability, against the home she fell asleep in, there were people who got up early and stayed up late and cross-referenced addresses in newspaper clippings and filed motions for free and did not stop. I wanted her to grow up knowing, without ever knowing the details, that she had been fought for. I went downstairs. My mother was at the kitchen table, the accordion folders in their usual order in front of her, even though there was nothing left to do. I think she just needed them there. I sat down across from her, and she made me tea without asking, the way she always does, and we sat together in the quiet kitchen without saying much. She said, eventually, "Tomorrow you're going to walk in there and you're going to be fine." I said, "I know." She said, "You've been fine the whole time. I need you to know that I know that." I didn't say anything. I just held the tea. And the next morning, I arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes early, sat down beside Priya at the plaintiff's table, put my hands flat on the surface in front of me, and waited for the judge to read. The custody schedule adjustment took 3 months to finalize operationally. Transitions, school calendar coordination, the practical geometry of splitting a child's life across 2 households without her feeling split. Lily handled it the way she handles most things, with the specific, resilient adaptability of a child who has always felt secure in her primary home, who has always known that her primary home is permanent. She does not ask about the hearings. She does not ask why Daddy has different rules every time, though she still sometimes mentions it in passing, the way children mention things that are simply part of their observable world. I do not explain. I listen, and I redirect, and I keep the cabinet stocked with her preferred cereal, and I come to every school event and every recital and every performance of the second grade play where she played a raindrop and delivered her single line with a seriousness that made every adult in the room smile. She is, in the end, the only metric that ever mattered. There is a thing that happens after a long fight finally ends that no one tells you about. You expect to feel relief, and you do feel it. It is real, and it is significant. And the first morning, after the ruling, I woke up before my alarm and lay in the quiet and just breathed for a long time, which is something I had not been able to do without an undercurrent of calculation for 4 years. But after the relief, there is a period of strangeness. Because the fight has been your structure. It has been the frame around every day. What do I need to do today? What do I need to document? What do I need to prepare? And when the frame comes down, there is a moment where you have to remember who you are when you are not in the fight. I am still figuring that out, if I am honest. I know that I am a mother. I know that I am someone who keeps a plant alive through things that should have killed it, who reads 3 stories when 2 would have been enough, who sat at a kitchen table with her own mother in the quiet and did not need to say much. I know that I am someone who builds carefully and waits and does not announce what she's building until it is finished and standing. And I know that the counterfile is in a banker's box in the back of my closet, fully indexed, alongside the little newspaper clipping in its frame and the copy of the ruling Priya gave me, and the notebook I started in my driveway after the first hearing. I will probably never need any of it again, but I have not thrown it away. Some things you keep not because you need them, but because they are proof that you did the work. That when it mattered, when it was hard, when you were tired and the 8 months in the middle felt like moving through cement, you kept going. You built the thing. You let the thing stand. And when the judge read, she read something worth reading. That is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. If you are still here, thank you. If this story found you at a moment when you needed it, I hope it gave you something useful, not a blueprint. Every fight is its own architecture, but a reminder, maybe, that the loudest person in the room is not always the most prepared person in the room. That patience is not the same thing as acceptance. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can build is the thing no one sees you building. Subscribe if you want to hear what comes next, because the next story is about a man who maintained a second life, second address, second family, second name for 6 years while his wife raised their children in the same city, and how she found out, and what she had quietly prepared for the exact moment when she did. It is a story about architecture, about what gets built in secret and what gets built in answer. I'll see you there. There is something I have not yet told you about Owen, because telling it requires me to be honest about a thing that is uncomfortable. I did not stop loving him all at once. That is not a romantic statement. It is not a nostalgic one. It is simply true. And I think it matters to the story because the most disorienting part of leaving a marriage to someone like Owen is that the person you fell in love with, the person who sent follow up messages and brought home flowers on unremarkable Tuesdays, that person was real. He existed. And when the relationship began to change, when the ledger started and the reframing started, you do not immediately understand that the early version and the later version are the same person. You think something has gone wrong. You think there is a version you might get back. I spent 2 years of the marriage trying to get that version back. 2 years of asking the right questions in the right tone, of timing difficult conversations carefully, of reading articles, about communication and attachment and trying to apply them to a situation they were not designed for. 2 years of thinking that if I could just find the right words, the right approach, the right moment, something would shift back. It did not shift back. It was never going to shift back. Because the early version of Owen was not a different person from the later version. The early version was just the version that had not yet decided I had served my purpose. And once he had decided, the architecture that had always been there, the careful ledger, the methodical documentation, the patient building of a case, turned in my direction, and I had no framework for understanding what I was looking at. Wendy gave me that framework. It took about a year of weekly sessions, and it was not comfortable, and I am not going to pretend it was. But I want to be clear about something. Understanding the architecture of what Owen did does not mean I hate him. It means I understand him. And understanding him is what allowed me to stop being surprised by what he was capable of, which is what allowed me to build toward it instead of away from it. I do not have a word for what I feel toward him now. Not forgiveness. That implies something was asked for and granted, and nothing has been asked for, and I am not in the business of granting things that aren't requested. Not hatred that would require him to occupy more of my attention than he does and he does not. Something closer to recognition. A clear-eyed accounting of who he is, filed in the appropriate mental folder, neither embellished nor minimized. Lily will grow up knowing him. She will form her own sense of him. I have decided, and it was a decision, not an impulse, that I will not participate in building a version of her father for her. She will build it herself. From her own observations, across her own time with him, in the way children always do when they are given the space to see clearly. My job is not to narrate. My job is to make sure she always has somewhere stable to land when she is figuring it out. That is the job. That is the whole job. And I have decided it is enough. Let me tell you about Priya. Before the custody proceedings began, I had never hired an attorney for anything more complicated than a lease review. I did not know what a good family law attorney looked like. I found Priya through a recommendation from a colleague whose sister had gone through a difficult divorce. Not similar in the specifics, but similar in the feeling my colleague described when I explained the early hearings. The sense of something being systematically constructed with professional assistance against a person who had not yet understood what kind of professional assistance was needed to answer it. Priya was 41 years old when I first walked into her office. She had a degree that I would tell you if it wouldn't identify her. She had a way of sitting very still when I talked, and a way of asking the next question that made me feel just like he'd already been thinking 3 questions ahead. She had 2 children of her own, which I learned because I asked her once in a session that had run long and was veering into something more honest than professional, whether she had ever been afraid for someone. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Every day." I understood that she was talking about her children. I did not ask more, but something shifted in how I understood her after that. She was not just someone who had studied family law. She was someone who understood what was actually at stake. Someone for whom the child's best interest was not a legal phrase, but a lived category. She filed 3 motions for free in the final stretch. I did not ask her to. She called me one afternoon and said, very simply, that she had reviewed our billing arrangement and that she was going to absorb the costs of the final filings, and that she wanted me to spend the money I would have spent on something Lily would like. I bought Lily a set of art supplies, the kind with 64 colors, which felt like an excess I could not previously have justified, and watched her spend an entire Saturday afternoon painting rocks. I sent Priya a photograph of the rocks. She sent back 2 words: worth it. Priya and I have kept in occasional contact since the ruling. Not socially, that is not the nature of the relationship, and I think she would be uncomfortable with the framing. But I send her a photograph of Lily every year on the anniversary of the ruling. A small ritual, a small acknowledgement of the year that has passed and of who made it possible. She always replies, 2 words or 3. Once she said, "She looks wonderful." Once she said, "Keep going." Once she said nothing except a small image, a photograph she had taken from a window of some morning light through glass. And I looked at it for a long time before I understood what she was communicating, which was simply, "I see. I remember. It mattered. That is all I needed. That is all either of us needed." The night of the ruling, after Lily was asleep and Barbara had gone to bed and the house was quiet, I sat at the kitchen table with the counter file open in front of me for the last time. I did not read it. I knew it by heart. Every tab, every index, every page in the order Priya had placed them, the summary document on top with the title in plain text. Summary of evidence and procedural findings. Custody matter. Plaintiff. 147 pages that had taken 3 years to build and 11 minutes for a judge to read and 31 pages to answer. I closed the binder. I put the rubber band around it. I put it in the banker's box with the notebook and the newspaper clipping in its frame and the copy of the ruling. I carried the banker's box to the back of the closet and put it on the shelf. And then I went to Lily's room and stood in the doorway for a moment, listening to her breathe. Children breathe so evenly when they are sleeping. There is no calculation in it, no strategy, no sustained awareness of threat. It is just breathing in and out with the complete unconscious trust that the room is safe and the night is ordinary, and whoever is responsible for making it that way has done their job. I had done my job. I closed her door quietly and went back down the hall. I made myself a cup of tea. I sat at the kitchen table in the empty house and drank it slowly, without opening anything, without making any notes, without calculating anything at all. Just breathing. In and out. Ordinary. That was the night I understood that winning is not a moment. Winning is what comes after the moment. The ordinary nights that accumulate quietly in the space that used to be occupied by the fight. Winning is the Tuesday evening with no court date on the calendar, the Saturday with the 64 colors. The phone call from Phoebe at 7:30 in the morning, because apparently second graders do not observe reasonable calling hours. The rocks on the windowsill with their careful, still crooked labels. Winning is the breathing, and I will take it. Every unremarkable night of it, every ordinary, accumulated, undefended Tuesday of it. I will take every single one.